August 20th, 1944. The road east of Chambois, the last days of the Falaise Pocket. A German panzer burns nearby, thick black smoke pouring from its hatches. This is what a dead tank looked like on this road that week. But advancing Allied soldiers only had to walk another 20 meters past the wreck to find something completely different. In a ditch, sitting like a forgotten car, was a 57-ton Tiger. A machine whose frontal armour no Allied gun could reliably beat. Not one hole in the turret. No scorch marks on the hull. Hatches open, engine long cold, crew gone without a trace. Every account of that summer credits the P-51 Mustang with killing tanks like this one. And the strangest part is that the aircraft may not have fired the shot that stopped it at all. The P-51 was never meant to fight tanks. North American Aviation designed it in 1940 at the request of the British Purchasing Commission, and its entire reason for existing was range and speed at altitude, not ground attack. It escorted heavy bombers, the job that made it famous. A Packard-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin gave it the power to fight the Luftwaffe over Berlin and get home again. 6.5 O-caliber Browning machine guns rode in the wings, 3 per side, feeding from up to 1,880 rounds of ammunition total. Good weapons for killing enemy fighters. Nobody at North American had drawn them with tank armour in mind. By the summer of 1944, the picture on the ground had changed the assignment. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of what it had been 2 years earlier, and fighter groups that had spent 1943 shepherding B-17S now had spare capacity and idle guns. The 354th Fighter Group, the first unit to fly the Merlin-engine P-51B in combat, and proud enough of the fact to call itself the Pioneer Mustang Group, got reassigned to the 9th Air Force. After the Normandy breakout, it operated under General Elwood Pete Quesada's tactical command. Then under the 19th Tactical Air Command supporting George Patton's Third Army, flying armed reconnaissance ahead of American columns instead of escort above them. On July 4th, 1944, a 354th pilot flew Eisenhower himself over the St. Lo sector in the backseat of a Mustang so the Supreme Commander could study the terrain before the breakout began. A bomber escort had become a road watcher. So the aircraft that ended up over German tank columns that August was carrying weapons chosen for shooting down Messerschmitts, flown by pilots who had spent most of the war at 25,000 feet, now asked to solve a problem nobody had designed the plane to solve. How do you stop 50 tons of armour from a strafing pass at 350 miles an hour? The system built to make that possible had almost nothing to do with the airframe itself. By mid-1944, the 9th Air Force had wired tactical air support into the advancing ground columns directly. Radio jeeps rolled with the lead tanks of Patton's divisions staffed by controllers who could talk to a flight of Mustangs circling overhead and redirect them onto a target minutes after it was spotted, not hours. That link mattered more than any single gun or bomb rack. A fighter group flying blind reconnaissance over unfamiliar roads finds targets by accident. A fighter group being talked onto a specific column by a controller sitting 3 miles from it, watching the same road through binoculars, finds targets on the first pass. It also meant something the post-war analysts would later find easy to overlook. A Mustang pilot in August 1944 rarely made an independent decision about what counted as worth attacking. He was pointed at something already identified as a problem for the advance, and increasingly that something was not a tank at all, but whatever was keeping the tank fed, fueled, and moving. This was a new way of using a fighter that had spent 2 years defined almost entirely by altitude. The Mustang's whole reputation had been built at 25,000 feet and above, the plane that could finally follow German fighters up into the thin air where American bombers were dying. Dropping it down to treetop height into a job measured in seconds over a single road instead of hours over a bomber stream meant throwing out most of what had made the aircraft famous and keeping only the part nobody had planned around, 6 guns and enough ammunition to matter, in a country full of thin-skinned targets that had never been the point of the design. Here is where the popular version of this story usually gets loud and confident, and where it should instead get quiet. A Tiger I's frontal hull carried around 100 millimeters of armor, effectively immune to anything an aircraft machine gun could throw at it. The weak points, if you could call them that, sat on top, roughly 25 millimeters on the turret roof and engine deck, and something in the neighborhood of 20 millimeters on the belly. Those numbers sound thin next to the frontal Gladys. They are not thin compared to a .50 O caliber M2 Browning. Fired from a diving fighter, the round could rattle a tank crew's nerves and strip paint off the hull. It could not reliably punch through a quarter-inch of hardened deck plate, and it stood essentially no chance against the belly armor at all. The myth that it could trace his back, as far as historians researching the claim have been able to determine, to a wartime statement by a USAAF general suggesting that .50 O caliber rounds might ricochet off pavement and up into a tank's thin underside. It was wrong on the physics. A round losing that much energy in a deflection off asphalt would not retain the velocity to penetrate anything, but it was the kind of claim that spreads faster than the correction. Aviation histories inherited it. War documentaries inherited it from them. None of this means the 6-gun broadside was useless. Against soft-skinned trucks, half-tracks, staff cars and fuel bowsers, it was lethal in the truest sense. Against a Tiger's deck plate, 6 machine guns concentrated their fire on a spot built to take exactly that kind of punishment and keep running. It's worth being specific about what those guns actually fired. Armor-piercing incendiary mixed with ball and tracer, muzzle velocity close to 2,900 feet per second, nearly 3 times the speed of sound, fast enough to shred sheet metal, fast enough to rupture a fuel tank or torch a truck's cargo in one pass. Against face-hardened plate, none of that speed mattered the way it sounds like it should. Outrunning sound is not the same as beating steel built to stop you. So if the guns weren't punching through the armor, what were the pilots actually doing over those roads? And why did the tanks stop anyway? After Normandy was secured, British and American operational research teams did something pilots rarely get to do. They walked the battlefield and counted. Teams inspected hundreds of destroyed and abandoned German vehicles, examined each one for cause of loss, and compared their findings against the claims filed by fighter squadrons. The gap was staggering. During Operation Goodwood in July, the 2nd Tactical Air Force and 9th Air Force together claimed roughly 390 tanks destroyed, most credited to rocket-firing Typhoons. During the German counterattack at Mortain in early August, pilots claimed over 250 more. Add up every Allied air unit's claims across the entire Normandy campaign, and the total runs into the thousands. When the ground teams tallied the actual wrecks and cross-checked them against verifiable air attack damage, the figure for the whole campaign came out under 100 tanks, out of roughly 1,500 German tanks, tank destroyers and assault guns lost in Normandy altogether. Less than 7% could be attributed directly to aircraft weapons. Pilots weren't lying mostly. A tank that stops moving, starts smoking from a near miss, or gets abandoned in a panic looks identical from a diving cockpit to one that just took a fatal hit through the deck. The claim gets filed as a kill either way. Debriefing officers had no way to check any of it in real time. A pilot came back, described what he'd seen through gunsmoke and adrenaline at 350 miles an hour, and the number went into the daily tally. Multiply that across every squadron flying every day of a campaign, and the totals climb far past what a slow walk through the wreckage afterward could ever confirm. What the operational researchers found instead was something less cinematic and, in its own way, more interesting. German armour wasn't dying from bullets punching holes in it nearly as often as it was dying from being stopped, stranded, and left behind. The same pattern showed up on the Eastern Front and in Italy, wherever anyone bothered to check. Across every theatre studied, air-delivered weapons accounted for somewhere between 2 and 7% of total tank losses, no matter which air force was flying or which aircraft was doing the shooting. Rocket-firing Typhoons, cannon-armed IL-2s, bomb-carrying Thunderbolts, machine-gun-armed Mustangs, the numbers barely moved between them. The problem wasn't the weapon. It was the target. A moving vehicle a few feet wide, seen for 2 or 3 seconds from a diving cockpit doing 350 miles an hour, is one of the hardest things in the war to hit precisely enough to matter, and armour of any real thickness needs a precise hit to fail. Follow that thread and the picture of what fighter bombers were actually accomplishing over French roads starts to look completely different. 6.5 O-caliber Brownings converging their fire at roughly 250 to 300 yards were devastating against exactly the kind of target German armoured columns depended on and couldn't do without. Fuel tankers, ammunition trucks, half-tracks hauling infantry, staff cars carrying the officers coordinating the retreat. A Panther or a Tiger with a full tank and stocked ammunition could shrug off a strafing run and keep moving. A column that had just lost its fuel Bowsers 3 miles back could not. Mustang pilots flying armed reconnaissance for Patton's advancing Third Army spent as much of their time hunting those soft targets as they did diving on the tanks themselves, and the effect compounded across a retreating army. Destroy the fuel trucks and tanks run dry on the road. Kill the officers in the staff cars and columns lose coordination. Force crews to abandon their vehicles under repeated strafing and take cover in the ditches, and even an undamaged tank becomes a stationary target for artillery, for the next wave of aircraft, or simply for advancing ground troops to walk up and claim. That is the trick, if there was one. Not a gap in the armour that a lucky round could find, but a system with a dozen weak points that had nothing to do with steel thickness at all. Fuel, coordination, morale, and the raw physical space needed to keep moving. None of it required a new weapon or a secret modification to the aircraft. The 6 guns, the ammunition, the convergence settings, all of it was exactly what the Mustang had carried since it left the factory as a bomber escort. What changed was the target list, and the understanding, hard won over a summer of overclaimed kills, of what that list actually needed to include. Falaise is the exception that tests this theory, and it holds up under the pressure. Through most of the Normandy campaign, German armour moved mostly at night or under cover, and pilots simply couldn't find enough of it in daylight to make air power decisive. By the second week of August 1944, that changed. The Falaise Pocket closed around the German 7th Army and elements of the 5th Panzer Army, and the roads leading east toward the Seine became the only way out. There weren't enough of them, and there wasn't time to wait for darkness. For the first time in the campaign, German armour was forced to move in daylight, in the open, nose to tail, with nowhere to disperse. Researchers studying that specific phase of the fighting found that the share of tank losses attributable to air attack jumped to something close to 47%, nearly 7 times the campaign average. Not because the guns had suddenly gotten better at penetrating armour, because a traffic jam under constant air attack turns every soft target kill into a tank kill by proxy. Destroy the truck blocking the road, and every vehicle behind it sits still under the guns until its crew abandons it. One Normandy loss survey found that of the vehicles recorded as abandoned rather than destroyed outright, well over 2/3 were lost during that single phase of the campaign. The Falaise closing, when movement itself became the thing that killed tanks, and stillness became fatal. The 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion's experience that summer reads almost like a case study built for the purpose. Already worn down after weeks of fighting near Caen, the battalion had lost most of its original tanks by the time Operation Goodwood closed in mid-July, 13 in the first day of fighting alone. Equipped with a fresh company of King Tigers at the end of July, arguably the most heavily armoured fighting vehicles in the European theatre, the battalion lost nearly the entire company to Allied air attack within days. Only 2 of those tanks made it back to Germany. Some of that was direct bomb and rocket damage. Some was almost certainly abandonment under sustained harassment, in a retreat with no fuel, no repair depots, and no cover left to hide in. The distinction hardly mattered to the crews standing in a ditch, watching their tank burn, or simply watching it sit there, out of options. Compare that to what happened to German armour when the same battalion still had room to disperse and move at night, back near Caen in June and early July. Losses were real but survivable, and vehicles that broke down or ran short of fuel usually had time and cover to recover before daylight came. The difference wasn't the aircraft attacking them, it was the road running out. Give an army room to breathe and even outdated aircraft struggle to catch it. Squeeze it into a handful of lanes with no darkness left to hide in, and even a machine gun starts to look like the weapon that won the battle. Right up until someone walks the wreckage afterward and counts what was actually still armed and dangerous when it stopped. The tactic had a price, and the Mustang paid it more than most of the aircraft doing the same job. One rifle caliber round through the coolant lines, that's all it took. The Merlin ran on liquid coolant pumped through a radiator under the fuselage, a single point of failure and the engine seized within minutes, sometimes faster. Compare that to the Thunderbolt's air-cooled radial, which could absorb dozens of hits and keep running, or the Typhoon's Napier Sabre, built for exactly this kind of abuse. Pilots and squadron records from the period noted that once Mustang units shifted from high-altitude escort to low-level strafing, ground fire, not enemy fighters, became the leading cause of losses. The aircraft best suited by speed and range to fly deep, fast interdiction missions over enemy columns was, mechanically, among the worst suited to survive the ground fire that came with flying low enough to use its guns at all. That trade-off rarely makes it into the highlight reel. It's easier to tell a story about a machine gun finding the one weak spot in a Tiger's armour than to explain that the pilots pulling off these missions were flying an aircraft one lucky rifle round could kill in order to strafe fuel trucks instead of tanks, so that the tanks would strand themselves. Squadron loss records from Mustang groups reassigned to ground attack duty in mid-1944 show the shift plainly enough. Air-to-air losses to German fighters kept falling as the Luftwaffe's fighter force shrank. Losses to flak and small arms fire kept climbing, month over month, as more sorties went low and slow over roads defended by whatever rifles and machine guns a retreating column still had mounted on its trucks. A Mustang pilot flying escort at altitude in early 1944 faced a mostly beaten enemy air force. A Mustang pilot flying road reconnaissance that August faced a much larger number of guns, all of them pointed straight up, none of them needing to hit anything vital to end the mission. Which returns to that Tiger sitting in the ditch east of Chambois. No penetration marks, no fire damage to the hull. Just an empty fuel tank, open hatches, and a crew that had made a calculation somewhere along that road. An operational tank with no fuel and no way out was worth less than 5 men who could still run. The gun camera footage that survives from those days over the Falaise Pocket shows Mustangs diving again and again on vehicles that weren't tanks at all. Fuel bowsers, halted trucks, columns of soft-skinned transport stretching back from wherever the road had jammed. The tanks in the frame usually just sit there, absorbing fire they could have shrugged off, waiting for their crews to decide the war had already found a way to beat them without a single round ever reaching the steel. Every account of that summer credits the P-51 with a tank-killing reputation it never earned through armour penetration and never really needed. The kill claims filed in 1944 inflated the numbers by a factor the operational researchers spent years trying to correct. What actually stopped those tanks on that road wasn't a machine gun round finding the one gap in a quarter-inch of hardened steel. It was an engine with nothing left to burn. The correction never really caught up with the story. Squadron records got filed away, operational research reports got stamped and archived, and the version that survived into memoirs, air shows and documentaries stayed the simpler one, the one where American guns found the one weak spot a German engineer had missed. Nobody sat down after the war and told the pilots of the 354th that most of the tanks credited to them had actually died of something closer to starvation than gunfire. Most of them probably wouldn't have believed it. From the cockpit, a column of burning trucks and a column of abandoned tanks look almost the same on the way back to base. Both count as a good day's work, and only one of them required the tank's armour to fail at all. 70 plus years later, the story still gets told the easy way, because the easy way is more satisfying. A machine gun finding the one gap nobody accounted for, physics bent just far enough to let the underdog win. The real version asks for less drama and more patience. A fighter never built for the job, pointed at the wrong targets on purpose until an army with nowhere left to drive simply ran out of road and out of fuel and out of reasons to keep fighting from inside a tank that could no longer go anywhere at all.